We're all set, Martha.
Hello, hello. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. What we hope to will be a enlightening and thought-provoking conversation. I'm Martha Doran, the Executive Director of the Art Therapy Project, and I'm so happy to be kicking off tonight. The Art Therapy Project is a nonprofit mental health organization that provides free group art therapy to adults and youth who have experienced trauma. Each year, we work with more than 100 people, including veterans, survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, members of the LGBTQ community, and youth and young adults who are in the foster care system or who are involved with the justice system. We work with caregivers and individuals facing addiction challenges. One of our goals as an organization is to increase awareness about art therapy, the benefits of it, as well as the issues and challenges that are in the forefront of the field right now. And it was through that lens that I first approached Curtis from Artistic Noise to discuss a collaboration. And that led us to tonight and our first Let's Talk Art Therapy conversation. Curtis and I were talking about the shared trauma we're all experiencing right now and the impact that it's having on our organizations, our staff, our program participants. You know, the reality of COVID hitting the hardest in communities of color and the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement have caused a lot of us to be thinking about the long-term impact that 2020 is going to have on a lot of people and on our mental health. And, you know, we want to acknowledge that mental health is finally becoming a mainstream topic of conversation. The stigma around mental health in communities of color has not been getting a lot of mention. And at the same time, it's no secret that there is a lack of racial diversity in the field of art therapy. So we believe these issues are connected, and we thought it was important to explore them with our peers. And we know that a 1-hour conversation is not going to solve anything, but it's our hope that the conversation will be the start, and it will increase awareness around these issues, and it'll give us an opportunity to explore how, as thought leaders and agents of change, we might be able to address some of these issues. I want to thank this amazing group of art therapists who are joining us tonight. I think by now all of us know what it means to volunteer to spend an extra hour on Zoom after a full workday. So thank you very much. And to all of you who joined us, you also are adding an hour of Zoom time, so thank you. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our co-host for this evening, Curtis Young, the Executive Director of Artistic Noise. Curtis.
You're muted. Curtis,
you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Martha, and everyone who's watching on Facebook Live. As you mentioned, this is a very natural partnership, not only with the Art Therapy Project, but with all of our amazing panelists this evening. I've had a chance to have many conversations with you all about the topic, and I work with many of you directly on this very important subject matter. So I'm really appreciative of all the panelists this evening. I'm looking forward to learning myself and growing with you all as we dive into this very important topic. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the torch over to the moderator for the evening, who is someone I consider to be not only a partner, but also a friend. Liz Della Carpini is someone who has worked with Artistic Noise for, I would say, more than 10 years now. Liz came to Artistic Noise through a partnership with one of our co-founders of Artistic Noise, Lauren Edelman. They worked together in community settings, and somehow over the years, they kind of migrated and navigated and ended up being with our current programs at Artistic Noise. Liz is affiliated with the School of Visual Art as an art therapist. She is the internship coordinator and manages the Masters in Public in MPS Art Therapy Department program. So we have come to work with her through the internship lens. We also have partnered with Liz for about 5 years, working with their graduate students in art therapy program to provide additional support for our art and entrepreneurship students. And they have been working to create public murals under the SVA project for the past 5 years. It's been a really great experience for our youth as well as for the organization as well, to really help us think deeply about the services we are providing and what art therapy means in the community framework. So that's been our relationship, and it's been great working with Liz. And I'm going to pass it over to her to get the conversation started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Curtis, for that warm welcome. And thank you, Martha, as well. And thank all of you for joining us tonight. I'm really honored to be here with this esteemed group of New York-based art therapists, and Chloe Hayward, if you want to wave to the camera, Ariel Miles, Lindsay Lederman, Jason Montalvo, and Josh Brancho. And the panelists are all going to introduce themselves tonight. So I'll pass it on to Chloe, if you'd like to start.
Sure, thanks. Thanks so much. Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you tonight. My name is Chloe Hayward. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm an artist, an educator, and a licensed, registered, board-certified Black art therapist based here in Harlem, New York. I've worked in the arts and education for years, and I'm currently the manager of education programs at the Studio Museum Harlem. And I'm also a proud, very proud member of the board of directors for Artistic Noise, which is an incredible organization committed to working in community and uplifting the voices of youth impacted by the justice system through the arts. I'm someone who's deeply interested in and committed to the intersection of art, education, and mental health. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jason.
Thanks, Ariel, and equally, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. It's a great privilege and honor. My name is Jason Montalvo. I'm an per diem art therapist currently working with Mercy First. That is a foster care agency that mainly works from Long Island and services the 5 main boroughs. And I work with a diverse population group of 4 to 20-year-olds, and also providing therapy services, not only just to the foster children, but also to the foster family and with the biological family for the pursuit of reunification. And with that, again, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this, and I will pass it to Ariel.
Thank you, Jason. Good evening, everybody. I'm really honored to be here. I am a licensed creative arts therapist based in Brooklyn, New York, living and working in Brooklyn, New York. I strongly believe in providing services for my community. I'm a big advocate on that. I currently work at a domestic violence emergency shelter, and I'm extremely passionate about art and art making as a form of therapy. For years I'm engaged in art, spoken word, dance, etc. So not only is it therapeutic and healing for me, I've seen what it can do for others, and I firmly believe in its healing potential. So I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation with these people, these amazing art therapists. I'm really looking forward to continuing it tonight and in the future. And with that said, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Josh.
Thanks, Ariel. My name is Joshua Brancho. I'm a licensed creative art therapist in New York State. I am based in Jersey, but I do most of my work in New York State. I'm a full-time art therapist with the Art Therapy Project, which has given me the privilege to work with a very diverse range of clients. I run groups with the LGBTQ community, veterans, mixed trauma, sexual assault, addiction recovery, and I also, as a side job, work at the Newark Beth Israel Hospital in their behavioral health program with their inpatient psychiatric units. It is the coolest thing to be an art therapist. I just am ecstatic to have found the field and to be engaged at this level in terms of supporting, developing, and promoting mental wellness through the creative process. And it's a privilege to be here as well with all of these wonderful people, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Without further ado, I'll pass it on to Lindsay.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm also just going to repeat what everyone said. I'm really grateful to be a part of this group and grateful to all of you for joining us today. I'm the clinical director at the Art Therapy Project. and an art therapist. I've been practicing for almost 15 years. I spent my bulk of my career at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital working with youth, teens, and families in the outpatient psych clinic. I also have a background working with the medical population in the children's hospital. And my privilege now is to continue to get to do what I do as an art therapist with new people at the Art Therapy Project, working with veterans and people experiencing secondary trauma as caregivers. And most of all, it's being a part of this community that has these kinds of conversations. I'm just really, really honored to be a part of. So thank you all.
So thank you, everyone. We're here, as you all know, today to discuss what we can do to advance diversity in the field of art therapy. And before we start, we would like to note the following, that our definition of diversity is that of a broad, multi-layered experience. As Chloe noted, diversity with a capital D that includes but extends beyond Black people. And two, that we're interested in the relationship between diversity and representation. So for our first question this evening, we'll start off with Chloe. Can you shed some light on the historical stigma of mental health in communities of color and how this stigma may impact the field of art therapy?
Sure, thanks for that, Liz. Thanks for that shout out. Yeah, when I think about this question, my brain goes to what I like to call stigmatic or a systemic. So I think we have to first consider the root of stigma. You know, often we place labels and meaning without understanding the true context or the root of stigma. And I think it's important that we not only address how and what without first addressing why. You know, the mental health field, the medical field in general is just one of the many, unfortunately, systems in our country that's rooted in racism and oppression, historically using Black and brown bodies for experimentation. It's often been structured in a way that creates barriers to care, especially in communities of color. And so, you know, to all of this, I wonder, is it that the issue is stigmatic, or is this something deeper and systemic? Communities of color have been creating systems of care by and for each other for centuries. And that's why I personally believe deeply in community care as therapeutic space. This is something that the Art Therapy Project does, and this is something that Artistic Noise does so beautifully. I believe that therapeutic spaces should not be spaces of diagnosis where we're simply pathologizing people, but rather spaces of care grounded in equity. And that's all the way from the ways that we address an individual's experiences to how we personally as therapists connect to offering space for those experiences to be affirmed and uplifted. You know, the level of effort and energy we put into dismantling systems and structures of oppression, from how this field is taught to future therapists, all the way to how we offer spaces of care and healing, is going to really determine the level to that which stigma can be healed and redirected.
Yeah, and to that point, Chloe, the APA, the American Psychological Association, just issued an apology to BIPOC people. And Ariel, I see you shaking your head a lot, so I want to give you the, steer the next question towards you. Can you discuss how this stigmatic, systemic issues that Chloe was talking about, how that plays out in your art therapy practice?
Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Chloe. I think that was really beautifully worded. And I definitely was shaking my head because I think at every point I completely agree that because of a history of, like you said, mistreatment or having to create spaces, Black and brown people having to create spaces for care. I have seen things personally in my work where clients have been resistant, they've presented with mistrust. Oftentimes, depending on the person or the situation, of course, we all manipulate, but people have tried to manipulate, and that's on the negative end of the spectrum. But then I've also seen that due to stigma and destigmatization and creating spaces for people, where art therapy as a form of a non-threatening form of therapy has been inclusive. So I've been able to meet with people who are of Jewish faith, who identify as white or Asian or Black, who trusted me as a provider to, as a person, one, as a person who would understand them as on a human level, but also as a person who would be sensitive to the nuances of other people's cultures, and felt comfortable in the space. And again, not threatened through the use of art as a form of therapy. I've seen destigmatization of mental health through care and cultural consciousness. And then, like I said, on the negative end of the spectrum, I've seen mistrust and resistance to joining, people only showing up because they have to, they've been mandated to. People not trusting that the service might be adequate enough, or not trusting that they'll have their needs met because I'm just another health provider. And how can they trust me? And then to just backtrack again, on the opposite end of the spectrum, people meeting with me and then suddenly changing their views of what a therapist looks like and what therapy is, because of the relationship that we were able to build in the space that I've been able to hold for people. And I think that's one of the reasons I appreciate art as a form of therapy, the creative process as a form of therapy, because it's not as threatening, and it is so inclusive. Yeah, work can be really beautiful.
Just to piggyback on that, Ariel, I mean, both you and Chloe really hit a lot of, I think, deep threads that need to be worked through just in our system of practice. But that reality that, like, more often than not, I mean, not more often than not, but often treatment is mandated or like used almost as like a punishment. And maybe more in communities of color than non-communities of color, but just in general, when mental health support is utilized as a punishment, like, it adds to the layers of stigma that we face as therapists when we're just trying to create a healing environment somewhere that people can be, find their better selves. And I really like how you mentioned that, just the creative process is this non-judgmental process that can occur that allows for a broader perspective, a broader voice. And I feel like that reality of the mandated therapy, of the punishment therapy. I mean, I used to work in a middle school, and like, I don't know how often it was like, this kid is not acting right, like, you take him, and it was like, well, I can't take him as a punishment. Like, I'm going to take him and support him and mentor and whatever kind of relationship we can create, but it can't be a punishment. Like, that has one of the places we had to start specifically with those middle school kids. And I mean, I think that the broader awareness in terms of how that is being utilized and how we can be utilized maybe as more of a support rather than a punishment is important to highlight. So I just wanted to add on to that.
Yeah. Also, Josh, part of the side effects of diversity is inclusion, and so when we open up a conversation through art making, I mean, art is the universal language. It's the great equalizer. So I think just to highlight what Ariel mentioned, it is very non-threatening. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, in terms of diversity, it is about inclusivity. It is about inclusion. It's not about homogenizing and like minimizing to create one voice. It's about reinforcing every voice so they can stand on their own. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from all the panelists is this idea that in many ways in communities of color, the mistrust they bring to therapy and art therapy is in many ways healthy. And then there's different layers upon it, depending, like, if you're an art therapist of color, a white art therapist, it just adds on, being a white art therapist can add on to the healthy mistrust based on this history of stigma that clients may be bringing to, or the people we serve may be bringing to art therapy. And so I guess this just kind of brings us to our next general question. Within within this understanding, what can we do? Any ideas about what we can do to advance diversity in the field of art therapy? And I'm going to pass that on to Jason. Do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Just really loving what I've been hearing in regards to just increasing this diversity or addressing this diversity. And I've just really wrestled just with all the different ways that we could advance ourselves. And just something when I initially met with Chloe in this group, she said, you know, we exist. There is a diversity. Us art therapists of colors are out there. And so a number of ways that I was just considering is that in our training, especially at SVA, is that we're kind of told that art therapy is kind of secondary to psychotherapy. We have to do a lot of advocacy in the field, which led me just to a lot of considerations of things that we train for, in-services, experientials. Those are just bringing our directives into a space to allow people to have that experience. And I just considered, how can we take that further? How can we either recruit more so, more individuals of color? And by doing that, we can start at looking at potentially high school recruitment, providing in-services, programs, even services directly to those schools. Just considering my own high school back in the South Bronx, we didn't have any of those services. We didn't have any of those experiences that even enlighten us that these career paths or choices existed. So if we were to increase our reach and broaden our engagement with these communities, not just the high schools that are in underserved areas, but also the communities that are in those underserved areas, by creating more community projects such as murals, we can then continue and engage individuals in the conversation. What is psychotherapy? And not only that, destigmatize psychotherapy. It doesn't have to be this, you come in with a problem and we solve it. It can just be an experience where you can just have relief for just that 1 hour of your day. And so that was just one way. Another way is by similarly aggressively approaching undergrad schools, creating partnerships, providing these services and space for students to experience art therapy, experiencing experiential, even if it's not in that controlled therapeutic space. If we can go out there and lead a community project, we can do it there and constantly increase and put in people's minds that art therapy is out there. It's not just psychotherapy, talk therapy, which is something that we're still having to really challenge and confront constantly. I think with what Ariel, Chloe, and Josh said, that therapy is a punishment, or in communities that I've serviced in the past in the South Bronx, it's more, I guess mental health is more diagnosed and treated with medication. And that's something that I experienced a lot in encountering a lot of my clients of color, is that this assumption that we treat only through medication, or that this problem can be sorted no different than an injury. But if we can have more of these experiences, engage with the community more readily, we can definitely destigmatize not just art therapy, but psychotherapy in general. Additionally, I've just considered even partnerships with potentially like New York Psychotherapy Counseling Center, really well-established centers that serve large communities of underrepresented populations. Why aren't we more present in those spaces? There certainly are, but can we create more partnerships with them? There's just huge networks that we can coincide with. And one more area that I wanted to touch upon was also just in regards to retention within our own programs, which it's just creating more networks of support for students of color. In my own experience at SVA, I was one of 3 students of color, and ultimately only 2 students of color that graduated. My one classmate unfortunately didn't make it due to the fact that she felt this intense lack of diversity and the impact that it had on her. Had she had potentially a partnership, or the school had a partnership with cats of color, art therapists of color, we could potentially have more support if the faculty isn't a place or space where the students are seeing themselves reflected or really being able to get that support. And so those are just a few of the places where I was considering how we could advance more awareness and engagement.
I feel like also, just to add on, sorry, Liz, to add on to that idea in terms of diversifying kind of our awareness, like I felt like as a student, I wasn't learning a lot about art therapists of color. And the focus seemed to be on a relatively homogenous white canon, which I think is rooted in the field of psychology and just kind of the educational history that we're coming from. But if we can diversify the way that we talk about communities of care, I really like how you said that, Ariel. Just that idea where, you know, it should be a homegrown thing, not falling on the center canon, but, you know, everything in the margin has an equal power within the structure. That could help with the diversity within the field and within with the destigmatization of art therapy in general, or just mental health in general.
Yeah, Josh, I completely agree with that. And I think, to your point, it's a matter of, you know, what I like to call prioritization versus performance. You know, you can't give someone one cultural competency course and a hug, you know, and have them go forth in the world and show up into spaces preaching diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, we need to move away from this performance of inclusivity and really consider as institutions how we're prioritizing and embedding the fabric of racial equity and inclusion across the board. You know, I went to a graduate school where I was never taught about an art therapist who was one of the founders of my program. You know, they're a Black art therapist. So I just say all that to say, not to shame anyone, but to just say, like, we need to get real with ourselves and with each other and continue to have honest conversations about ways that we are including or, quite honestly, erasing people from this narrative.
And I love this conversation that kind of goes all the way back to our training, in addition to you know, how we're doing things now, because I think you know, there've been reference to being one of a few students of color and the support that you get. So also from the end of a white student, when I was, you know, what am I confronting in terms of my biases and my understanding of history, my going into communities that look very different than my own. And so really making sure that the work is done from that aspect of kind of ownership of my privilege, ownership of my lack of understanding, doing my own research in terms of understanding other cultures. You know, Ariel referenced like a whole, you know, everyone out there comes from somewhere that is so unique. And so the responsibility that we have to not show up to a session with a client and wait for them to educate us about their background. We always want to be curious about their personal story, but we should have knowledge ourselves of people's cultural backgrounds, and that certainly includes knowing the history of our own profession. So I love that, you know, through this conversation, and hoping that that can kind of trickle down to the beginning stages of when new art therapists are coming in, hopefully more art therapists of color are coming in, and seeing their representation in the books that we read and the teachers that we have. I think there's an opening for growth there for sure.
Ariel, would you like to add anything?
I'm just agreeing with everything everyone. As Lindsay ended, I was wondering too if that does include inclusion of more faculty of color, and then, as you said, reading books for more art therapists of color. And also, again, I thought, going back to my graduate class, students who were not Black or students of color working in communities of color who would share their experiences, and my understanding of when they shared, trying to be sensitive, but also thinking from a perspective of like, yes, because when someone who enters my community doesn't look like me, back to stigma, my assumption and the assumption of other people is, okay, what's the reason you're walking into my community? What do you actually know about me? What are you actually bringing here? And then how we can change that perspective. Because I also met a wonderful art therapist from Denmark who was sensitive to culture and cultural nuances and was welcome with open arms. So I think it depends. It's understanding, what we bring and how we show up in spaces, and being mindful of our privilege, and how we walk into a place that isn't ours. That makes sense.
Yeah, and so like walking into these spaces, and there's what we look like, and then there's also the language that we use. So I'm wondering, how have you seen, to any of the panelists, how have you seen the use of language impact your practice, either in a positive or a negative way?
I feel like language is a difficult component of the way that we interact, because we bring, without even like thinking about it subconsciously, we bring all of our background and power and privilege or existence into that space with the language that we use. And it creates a barrier if we're not able to really find common ground in language with the people that we're working with, whether they're colleagues or whether they're clients, whether they're just people in our community. And I mean, I feel like even like the way that I think about it is twisted in the sense like, and actually Liz, this goes back to a conversation we had years ago in terms of like working within foreign communities and the idea of tolerance, and how tolerance is almost the first thing that we think of when we think about inclusion, when in reality it has its own inherent power structure. It's coming from this assumption that ours is right and we're tolerating the other, and you know, shifting it from like a tolerant perspective to an open perspective where the inclusion is equitable, is equal, is available and open, and not including this kind of like preconceived value judgment. And I mean, as through our education, we're taught to speak as clinicians, and then like, how do you try to translate that and still maintain your practice and your support as a mental health agent, you know, within a community that just will go over their head. It reinforces the stigma. Language is so crucial to the way we work and finding that common ground. And I mean, I assume everyone has more to say on that, but I just, you know, when you said that, it made me think of that kind of conversation we had about tolerance.
I'm sorry, were you gonna go, Josh?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, language is so important. And I think when we talk about language, what we're really talking about is power, you know, because language is power. And as therapists, it's all about how are we using that power? You know, like Josh mentioned, you know, we're trained through this clinical lens and using this clinical language. And I personally believe that, yes, you know, in academia and we're writing and there's a time and place for that. But, you know, really therapy is about relationships. And I'm not there to, you know, beat you over the head with my degree and hit you with all this clinical jargon. You know, I'm there to communicate to you. I'm there to create space for you to communicate with me. And I think that part of how we use language is to really think about our own relationship to power and what kind of power dynamic, you know, we want to hold in the space. I just want to shout out someone in the chat who put a really poignant comment that one of the difficulties art therapists in the academy have is not being able to name white supremacy and what to do about it. Until very recently, that term was very charged and not spoken. So how are we making space for, you know, uncomfortable language to be spoken? And I think to do that, we also have to really look at art therapists, practitioners, and pioneers of the past, present, and future. You know, when I think about clinicians doing this work, I really think about Cliff Joseph. You know, I think about Lindsay Vance, who has done a lot of work around healing from racial wounds. And I also think about art therapists like Yasmin Awais and Sarah Pausty, who are thinking critically and deeply through writings about community-based approaches to healing. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Anybody else on the panel? So I actually had, as you're all talking, I actually had something related to artistic noise and Curtis and with the students about the use of language, where I really learned something and was humbled as a white person in the use of the word professionalism, and using professionalism with the students at A&E, because it's a work program, and actually with students, the graduate students, and realizing that, coming to realize that term had historically been used with people of color in a discriminatory way. And even with one of my white students from a blue collar background, how that term did not feel inclusive to them and made them feel separate. And so, yeah, I felt like humbled by that, but also I was able to open up conversations with my students about that word, and also then start removing that word from a lot of our training material and not using it. And it's, yeah, I just wanted to share that, just like kind of that personal piece that, it's okay to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and be humbled by them, and then do something about them and act yeah, so just wanted to share that. And I hear everyone talking too that how diversity in some ways can support the therapeutic process, and how you may see that because even as our therapists of color, there are always inherent power dynamics in the therapeutic relationship. As the therapist, we're always in the power position. So I just wanted to open up that question. Do you have any ideas about how you work with power dynamics, how diversity could support the therapeutic process?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that comes up a lot and is really kind of inherent in what you think of in psychotherapy is you go to your therapist's office and you sit in their space and you talk to them from their chair. And so, something that's really important is really creating a co-owned space. And when you are inviting, if it, which is what it is, sometimes you do have to invite people into your space, really creating a way to make that shared and co-owned. And I think that kind of lends itself in the whole therapeutic relationship, that relationship is co-created, that you are there to learn from and pass knowledge back and forth and help people to figure out their own journey and their own needs, and not necessarily to be imparting knowledge and the way to do things. So I think there's like a general approach, and I know some of the work that the Art Therapy Project has done, but obviously Artistic Noise, and just having community-based programming to be able to go into spaces that are in communities of color, that are with people where they live and where they're at, to create relationships with, potentially white therapists, but also, therapists of color, where there is kind of this equalized playing field where we're all creating together. Certainly mural projects have been, just an incredible, powerful force of showing that kind of community and coming together. So I think that co-creation of space is so important when it comes to that kind of equalizing of a power dynamic.
And recognizing that the power isn't really, when you're on an unequal playing field, if you're coming together, that it can't just be 50-50, that there has to be a little, kind of a tilt, and which voices are you lifting up that have been silenced and erased? And that's not easy to do. I wonder if anyone else has any thoughts about bringing these, we're talking about going into communities, but also bringing communities together.
I feel like some of the work that I've done has shown me just the power that some people can bring into the space. And I love supporting it. It doesn't always happen. A lot of times we're working with people who don't have the esteem level that will bring in and dominate the space for themselves, and navigating that dynamic in terms of trying to empower them through the process, give their voice the strength that they deserve, isn't easy and straightforward. But the few times where I'm just remembering one in particular specifically, where this guy was like, I'm really the master of my life and I'm here to teach you. And it's like, yes, like him finding that in that moment, it was just like a beautiful kind of experience, because really we don't go in there to teach them of who they are. We go there to try to help support them finding that for themselves. And it's not easy. It's not straightforward. you know, we've talked about language, we've talked about so many pieces that can get in the way and muddle the process. But I mean, I think as an advantage for us as art therapists, you know, we have that universal language, the creative process, which really kind of grounds the space in something that isn't lost through the rhetoric, through the language, through the words, because the creative process is this equalizer, which is, I mean, I'm, like I said earlier, I feel very privileged to be an art therapist. So
I'm noticing in the chat, this is great. There's people just posting the names of our therapists of color and past, present, and future. And it's making me realize one of the conversations that we had when we were preparing for this panel, the idea, is there really a lack of diversity of our therapists of color, or is there a lack of representation, and who has been erased, and so, and not whose voices haven't been lifted. And so right here, we're just really recognizing that there are so many people in our field already, and making people aware of that, and where can you go out and get these resources and read about our therapists of color and recognize the art therapists of color who are right here with us right now.
I think Liz, just to kind of add also to what Josh was sharing and also Chloe sharing, just in addressing that power dynamic, I found really greatly just in the work that I've done with my clients, especially as of late, there's a degree of transparency that I've learned to like incorporate within my work, and that's in regards to the language that I'm using. I think it's very critical that we just, again, use that language that we all understand. I also find that if we do utilize that language in and of itself, that clinical language that is, it becomes in itself a barrier. I've met many a client that very quickly wanted to say like, oh, I'm anxious, I have BPD. And those kinds of things are something that we have to undo. And so I've been very cognizant of just the relationship that we have. And I love that what Chloe says, that therapy is a relationship. It isn't just us being this static absorption of a person's sharing or their flood. It is a dynamic learning process. There's a give and take. Of course, we as therapists have to be much more mindful as to how much of ourselves we're allowing into the session, because this is their session. But I have found that it's a really wonderful way of helping my clients to feel more comfortable in the space with the process, destigmatizing it in the moment, and just being very honest with them as to that this may not be something that meets all their expectations, or we are going to come against predispositions or possible myths. And that's just been really helpful in just kind of dispelling a lot of this power that comes with the role.
Yeah, so you're making me think, the word that keeps coming up is this idea of vulnerability, and the art therapists putting themselves in a vulnerable position as well, and not only expecting the client to be in that position. And so I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts about vulnerability in their practice or working in different communities.
I think that when I think of vulnerability in work, I think one of my favorite things about the use of art, or the way I guess I see it or approach it, is that, I mean, I like the word support and co-owned space. Like I love those ideas, because I think my expectation of clients is just to, like, all they have to do is show up and just be. I've had people walk into a room, teenagers who have some idea of therapy and don't want to speak, walk into a room and sit slouched in a chair and just want to listen to music for 45 minutes. And I'm like, okay, well, that's part of the process too. And I can understand that, and I can assess that, and we can use that, and we can move forward with that. It doesn't always have to be painting or drawing or singing and dancing and or talking even. It's the way someone shows up, is to act, to exist. It's an act of creation. So just to be there and be present and to hold space for someone is to be vulnerable sometimes. And sometimes vulnerability is being, unfortunately, a mirror to someone's frustration, or, you know, to be on the receiving end of someone's transference, and to not take it personally. and to be understanding. Or I've even, so embarrassing, at one time, someone had lost her father, and I remember losing mine, and I cried, and she was like, oh, I understand, it's okay. So sometimes too, it's being honest with ourselves about our own experiences and being clear about the fact that we are human and we are there to support people and not judge. Because the tables were reversed, and I was telling my story. I'm sure someone would also be as open-eyed as they would assume I would do when they share theirs, you know. So I think that it's an intimate process, and I think people just showing up and existing is a big part of it, personally.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful. Oh, go ahead.
Thanks, Liz. I just wanted to say, to sort of piggyback on what Ariel was sharing, like, absolutely, you know, at the end of the day, we're all human beings, you know, and we began this conversation in talking about stigma, you know, and in working and co-collaborating, right, with individuals who may hold a stigma around mental health, taking a step into mental health and you know, a therapeutic exchange, that is taking a risk, you know, and to take a risk is to be vulnerable, you know. Even in the creative process, you know, we take risks. To be an artist, to be a therapist, those are ways that you have to take a risk in order to grow and to get to the other side of something. So, you know, I think that that's something we have to consider as well.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And that was such a beautiful example. And I love not only the vulnerability of the way of being, but also that broad, inclusive idea of what art is and what art can be, and the performative aspects of how it could be a song or just sitting together listening to music. I really appreciate that. So we are reaching the end of our hour together. So I'm wondering if there's any final thoughts from the panelists on our conversation tonight.
Just to piggyback on vulnerability, because I feel like it's such an essential component of the work that we do, not only being honest with our own vulnerability when we enter a space to support our clients, but the vulnerability they share or don't share in the space, and helping them navigate the capacity to actually be vulnerable with themselves, with us as the clinician. I mean, I think that we have a kind of secret weapon as art therapists, because when we do process art, and like art that's not focused on the product and that is made in a non-judgmental way, it gives us a way to work around vulnerability in terms of the creative process, which really allows us to maybe reach a slightly deeper level than like traditional talk therapy or just a standard encounter would allow. I mean, I think that, you know, the reality is, I mean, we wear our armor every day when we get on the train, when we walk down the street, and, you know, to come into a safe place, you know, whether it's now a Zoom room or what used to be, you know, an art therapy studio, you know, it's not easy to just kind of like leave it at the door. And so to have that art process to help kind of promote being in a slightly more vulnerable place for themselves, I think it gives us just a secret weapon in the process. And, you know, I just was thinking about that while you guys were sharing. So
thanks, Josh. So yeah, we have about 5 more minutes left. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And we hope that if you're an art therapist or a supporter of the field, that you'll continue these conversations and translate your ideas into action, because we can always have all these ideas and thoughts and it sounds great, but if we don't actually do something, it doesn't really mean very much. And we'd also like to thank, in addition to thanking all of you for showing up tonight, we'd like to thank Artistic Noise and the Art Therapy Project for facilitating this important conversation. And please stay in touch. You could learn more about the Art Therapy Project at arttherapyproject.org. You could learn more about Artistic Noise at artisticnoise.org. And I guess we are ending now unless any of the panelists would like to say some final words or a goodbye.
I just wanted, as you were talking before, and just was thinking back on some past experiences, just that there's always something I don't know. And so continuous learning and being open to saying, I don't know about that piece of history and I don't know about this, and just making the effort. I know I'll speak for myself to continue to be educated about things that I'm learning. So I hope that that's something that, you know, the field can continue to do also.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Sure.
And yeah, it's been such an honor to be here with all of you, and thank you again, and have a wonderful evening. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.